She was 7 years old, standing in the concrete median of Interstate 75 at 12:14 on a Thursday in the late October, barefoot except for one damp white sock gone gray at the heel, dress hem black with road grit, a plastic butterfly clip hanging crooked in her hair with one wing snapped clean off. Rain moved sideways in the midnight wind and struck the guardrail in a thin metallic ticking that never stopped. The median grass lay flat as if a hand had pressed it there. She did not lift her arms. She did not wave. She did not cry. She is small enough that the concrete barrier comes to the middle of her chest. Headlights cut over her face in hard white bands, then vanish, then return. Diesel hangs low under sodium lights at the off-ramp a quarter-mile south. A thick, oily smell that settles into wet fabric and the back of the throat. Cars split around her in two streams, northbound and southbound, spray rising from tires in white fans that catch the orange light and disappear. She keeps her feet planted on the painted seam where old repairs meet new asphalt, as if the stripe itself is instruction. A butterfly pin with one broken wing taps her temple each time the wind changes direction. By the time the clock over dispatch desk C rolled to 12:19, 112 cars and 19 freight trucks had gone past her or around her. 112 and 19. A church van with faded scripture lettering on the rear doors moved left and never braked. An off-duty deputy in his own pickup slowed, stared, and continued north. Two rideshare sedans with rooftop LEDs visible through rain reported lane obstruction and kept moving. Every vehicle made the same correction. Drift, split, continue. No one stopped in the live lanes, no one crossed the shoulder and put a body between the child and moving steel. At 12:21, a woman in a silver crossover called 911 with her hazards flashing and said, "There's a little girl in the middle, right by mile marker 51. She's just standing there." Her voice shook on the first sentence and then flattened into method, the way frightened people do when procedure feels like control. The dispatcher asked for direction of travel, nearest overpass, lane count, weather. The woman answered every question, then said, "She's not even crying." And silence filled the line for 2 beats before the dispatcher keyed the next channel. North Dayton General sat 1.8 miles away, its emergency entrance lit too bright for the weather, automatic doors opening and closing every 9 seconds as if ordinary rhythm still governed what came through them. Rainwater tracked across tile. The waiting room television played a muted weather map with blue bands moving over western Ohio. Inside triage, the air carried that sharp iodine smell cut with brewed coffee and disinfectant, and the fluorescent lights hummed like insects. A janitor mopped a crescent of muddy footprints near registration, while 2 paramedics signed transfer forms at a counter worn smooth at the edges. Out on I-75, the wind pushed wet cold through the child's dress and into her shoulders until the fabric clung like paper. A sheet of cardboard, soaked and dark, lay pinned against the median curb 10 feet behind her and pulsed each time a truck wake hit it. She watched the red taillights recede north in strings, then vanish behind the rise. She did not step into traffic. She did not retreat. She stood exactly where fast decisions had no room for, where each driver trusted the next to do what they would not do themselves. At 12:27, State Transport logged an entry on a mobile terminal. Child transferred. The field for receiving signature remained blank, the line posted anyway. Data moved forward because the software permitted it. The night kept its own records in water and noise. 2 firefighters in Engine 14 turned from Stanley Avenue with light bar reflections, jumping along wet concrete, and found only interrupted traffic, no stopped civilian vehicles, and a child still in the median, turning her face away from the beam. One knelt on the shoulder and spoke over the wind. She did not answer. She watched his mouth and looked back at the lanes. He tried again, slower, hands visible. No sudden movement. She shifted one bare foot half an inch and went still. The engine captain requested highway patrol for full stop support. Dispatch repeated the request at 12:31 and tagged it urgent. Rain thickened, then thinned again. The flow of traffic never fully broke. Freight moved through like weather of its own, high cabs and trailer sides breathing pressure over the median in heavy pulses that tugged at the child's dress. From the overpass, a man in a utility jacket filmed 10 seconds of video on his phone and sent it to 2 group chats with no caption. Another caller reported a possible decoy setup, said gang activity had been seen in the area, and advised units to stage before approach. Fear wrote its own story faster than facts could. By 12:36, the first trooper cruiser angled across 2 southbound lanes with rear strobes cutting red and blue through rain mist, and still vehicles kept threading the open space left of the blockade. The child stood in the same square of concrete, one sock dark with water, one foot bare and pink-white from cold. She was not shivering in the dramatic way people expect from children in weather. That was the detail responders would remember later and carry like a weight. She had gone past display and into endurance. The call volume climbed. Marker 51, female child, no adult in sight. Marker 51, near the split by the low concrete wall. Marker 51 again. A second dispatcher logged road hazard, then upgraded to endangered minor. A third patched highway patrol to city units and emergency management because lane shutdown on that stretch at midnight could cascade 5 exits south. Words stacked in terminals. Vulnerable, unknown, immediate, proceed with caution. At 12:41, another sound began to register beneath rain and freight, distant at first, low and mechanical. Not one engine, but many, turning under overpass concrete and collecting in the chest before it reached the ear clearly. Drivers in outer lanes looked into mirrors. Troopers looked north. The child did not turn yet. The rumble grew by degrees, then by leaps, a layered throb that rolled along guardrail steel and set the signposts trembling. 400 headlights rose over the north overpass in staggered formation, not random traffic, but a disciplined wave, chrome and black paint glinting under sodium lamps, riders in cut vests, hard profiles, helmets and bare heads, tattoos slick with rain, bikes running close enough that their beams fused into one advancing wall of white. 400. Dispatch logged it as a possible gang convergence at 12:43 and flagged officer safety in all caps before anyone on the net could explain the route pattern. Civilians on shoulder cams started backing away from the guardrail. A woman in a minivan with 2 children sleeping in booster seats locked her doors and whispered for no reason at all. The formation held speed to the marker and then widened as if on a command no one outside their line could hear. The front riders were broad men with weathered faces and old scars, leather dark with water, shoulders squared against wind, machines heavy enough to shake pooled rain loose from the bridge seams. Behind them came more rows, then more, until the count stopped looking like a group and started looking like weather. People saw ink, steel, beards, patches, and made their judgments in a single heartbeat. On the shoulder, a patrol sergeant keyed his mic and said, "All units hold position until intent is confirmed." His voice stayed level, but his free hand tightened on the door frame hard enough to pale the knuckles. One EMT at Engine 14 muttered that this was going to get bad before it got better. No one answered him. The child finally turned her head toward the sound, Headlight bands moved over her face in bright intervals, and for a moment the broken butterfly in her hair flashed silver, then disappeared again. She did not run. She did not crouch. She stood in the wet center line of a nation's refusal. And the people everyone feared were now close enough to be seen clearly, close enough for the night to decide what they had come to do. Paul Bennett rode in the third row on the left, rain striping his visor and working into the seam of his collar, his Road King heavy and steady beneath him as the formation widened across the northbound lanes and bled speed in one controlled sheet of chrome and black. He saw what the troopers saw first: 400 riders, cut vests dark with water, faces hard from weather and years, moving toward a child at midnight like the beginning of a headline nobody wanted. He also saw what they could not read from a distance, not in that light, not in that noise. Every front wheel was angled away from the median, not toward it. Every hand stayed high on the bars, open and visible. No one reached for anything except clutch and brake. A patrol sergeant stepped out from behind his cruiser door with rain running off the brim of his campaign hat, one arm raised in a flat stop signal that was more command than request. The line of bikes answered as one body, brakes pulsing red down the column, engines dropping from a roar to a hard, mechanical idle that sounded like restrained weather. The child stood where she had been, small at the center of concrete and light, butterfly clip flashing and disappearing as beams swept past her face. She still did not cry. That detail landed harder on Paul than the sirens. He put his left boot down, felt his knee click, and tasted old metal in the back of his mouth the way he always did when memory and urgency crossed wires. 49 years had put marks on him. People read quickly: the jagged scar along his left cheek from Basra, the faded ink on his forearms, the nose that had been broken twice. County time he never tried to explain away. None of that made him gentle. It made him precise. When he looked at the median, he did not see a traffic event. He saw a 7-year-old standing in wet wind while grown people waited for better conditions to be decent. The sergeant walked toward the front line, hand near his mic, eyes moving from patch to patch and back to Paul as if searching for one face he could negotiate with. "Who's in charge here?" he asked. Paul lifted his chin once. "Tonight I am. You do not move until I clear it." Paul nodded toward the median without shifting his stance. "We came for her." The sergeant held his gaze for a beat that stretched under the rain. Behind him, Engine 14 idled on the shoulder. One firefighter had his helmet pushed back and both hands wrapped around a thermal blanket he could not yet deliver. In the right lane, a minivan sat frozen with hazards, blinking amber into mist. 2 men on the overpass kept filming from behind chain link, their phone screens bright squares in the dark. The whole scene balanced on reputation and assumption, and everyone knew it. At 12:44, dispatch traffic shifted tone. Officer safety remained on the channel, but the words possible gang convergence were joined by something else from the trooper on scene: organized compliance. No one announced relief. Relief came as small mechanics instead, shoulders dropping a fraction, radios keyed with less strain, one paramedic stepping closer to the median curb because the bikes had taken enough live lane to give him a margin. Paul heard none of that through his helmet speakers, but he recognized the pattern. He had heard men fear a silhouette before. He had watched that fear collapse when the silhouette held a door, carried weight, stayed put. Sometimes the people who looked like trouble were the only ones who treated a child's life as urgent. The front rows dismounted in sequence, not a rush, each rider placing his machine in a stagger that created a wider visual wall for oncoming traffic while leaving a clean corridor for fire and medical approach. No one shouted, no one postured. Rain tapped helmets and tank metal, and the steel guardrail with the same thin insistence it had carried all night. Paul pulled his gloves off finger by finger, tucked them into his belt, and kept his eyes on the girl. She watched him now the way stranded children watched any adult who had not yet decided whether to pass by. One of the younger riders, a former line mechanic named Curtis, who had joined the club 8 years earlier and still rode as if speed could settle his thoughts, stepped close enough to speak without raising his voice. "Prez?" Paul did not look away from the median. "Hold formation. Leave the center clear." Curtis nodded and moved back, relaying by hand signal. 2 fingers down and a palm-out sweep they all knew from runs through mountain rain and city choke points. The line adjusted by inches. From the shoulder, it looked like threat reorganizing. From inside it, it was logistics. Across 3 lanes, the child shifted her weight once. The bare foot curled on wet concrete. The socked foot held. She lowered herself to a crouch, then stood again as a freight horn blared half a mile south and faded. A medic called to her, voice steady, words simple. She looked at his mouth, then at the motorcycles, then back to the stripe beneath her toes, as if it were a rule she had promised to keep. By 12:49, Highway Patrol had full stop in both directions for a controlled extraction window, and the sound that dominated the interstate was no longer panic or horns, but idling engines and rain. Troopers moved in pairs. Firefighters crossed with boards and blankets. A state camera truck rolled up too late to claim competence and parked under the overpass anyway. Amber bar turning slowly. Paul stayed by his bike with his shoulders squared into the wind, eyes locked on the child, until 2 medics reached the median edge and dropped to one knee in mirror motion, palms open, waiting for consent from someone who had learned not to grant it lightly. The paradox had already declared itself in plain view even before anyone touched the girl, even before one report line changed from hazard to child. The feared men had not come to take. They had come because everybody else had measured risk against inconvenience and chosen motion. When the medics finally guided the child off the concrete seam and across the closed lane, she moved with tiny, deliberate steps, carrying her own weight like a person older than 7. A firefighter wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. She did not clutch it. She did not reach for the nearest adult. She looked once toward the row of motorcycles, found Paul's face among rain and chrome, and then looked down at the pavement again. An ambulance door shut with a hollow metal thud that echoed under the bridge. The line of riders stayed in place until patrol reopened one northbound lane and cleared a controlled convoy route toward North Dayton General. Paul swung back into his seat, knees protesting as he lifted the bike upright, and fell into escort position behind Engine 14 and ahead of 2 cruisers, diesel and wet asphalt rising around them in layered smell. Siren light ran across retaining walls and warehouse siding as they moved south, then west, then into the hospital grid, where sodium lamps gave way to parking lot floodlights and bright glass. North Dayton General looked smaller from a motorcycle than it did from an intake desk, a low spread of brick and concrete added to in square pieces over 3 decades, each expansion using a different shade of tan until the whole place looked stitched together by budget cycles. Automatic doors at the emergency entrance opened and closed every 9 seconds, regular as breath, a rhythm so ordinary it felt obscene after the median. The rain had thinned to a cold mist by 1:06, and the wind carried iodine, bleach, old coffee, and the faint sweet rot of soaked leaves gathered in curb drains. Paul parked in a line marked for 15-minute drop-off and killed the engine. Cooling metal ticked under him. To his right, two riders from the women's chapter rolled in and removed their helmets, water streaming off braided hair onto leather shoulders. To his left, a trooper stood with his notepad open, looking tired enough to be honest. "You people coordinated fast," he said. Paul unbuckled his helmet and set it on the seat. "We were already moving." "For what?" "A stitch check," Paul said, and nodded toward the entrance where a broad man with a bandaged forearm waited under the awning, smoking with one hand cupped against drizzle. The trooper wrote it down and did not comment. Inside, the floor near registration shone with tracked rain and mop arcs, crescent marks overlapping in dull loops where the janitor had passed twice in 12 minutes. The waiting room clock read 1:12 in red digits that reflected on the vending machine glass. A television mounted high in the corner still ran muted weather graphics, blue and green bands crawling over county lines while closed captions lagged 6 seconds behind. A man in steel-toe boots slept upright with his chin on his chest. A woman held a paper basin in both hands and stared at nothing. Sandra Briggs stood at Triage Station 3 with reading glasses, low on her nose and a pen clipped to her scrub collar, night shift for 11 years, 34,000 documented patient encounters by her own rough count, and a habit of tapping the counter twice before she opened a new chart. She saw the leather first when Paul came through the doors, then the scar, then the club patch, and her shoulders drew tight in a motion she would deny later. She had grown up with stories about men like him that ended in flashing lights. This night had already rewritten one of those stories outside her building, but habit lagged fact by a few minutes. "Visiting hours are over," she said. "Brother needs discharge aftercare," Paul replied. He slid a folded card across the counter with the patient name and room number written in block print. His hands were clean but stained at the knuckles with old grease that never left completely. Sandra scanned the card, checked the chart, and handed it back. "Room 2B, short stay surgical. One visitor at a time." He nodded once. "Understood." In the hallway beyond triage, the fluorescent hum deepened, joined by monitor chirps at uneven intervals, the rubber wheel squeak of a supply cart, and the low thump of HVAC from ceiling vents that never seemed to shut off. A water stain shaped like the state of Florida spread over one acoustic tile near the turn to pediatrics. Someone had circled it in faded marker months ago as a joke. Maintenance had painted over the circle and not fixed the leak. On a corkboard near the staff break room, a work order yellowed at the corners listed door latch replacement. Requested 93 days earlier, status pending. By 1:24, rain returned in finer needles that hissed against the ambulance bay canopy and blurred the lot lights into soft halos. The convoy bikes outside sat in disciplined rows, engines off now, rain beating on tanks and saddlebags, while two riders walked perimeter at a slow pace with hands visible and eyes down, making no trouble, asking no favor. Inside, paperwork kept moving, transfer forms, intake stickers, a state incident packet stamped incomplete. Systems loved sequence. Systems did not always love children. Paul checked on his club brother in short stay, heard the nurse explain wound care in clipped professional lines, watched a printer jam and get slapped back to function, then stepped into the corridor again with the same unease that had ridden with him from the interstate. He could not have named it cleanly. Something in the building's rhythm was off by a fraction. The way a bike felt when one spoke had gone loose and the wheels still held true for another mile. At 1:31 on that wet Thursday, he turned toward the pediatric wing because the elevator near short stay was out of service again, and the stairwell cut through that corridor, and the automatic doors behind him kept opening and closing every 9 seconds. as if routine could still claim the night. The stairwell door near pediatrics stuck halfway on swollen weather stripping, and Paul had to put his shoulder into it to make it clear the latch. The push made his left knee click twice and sent a narrow pain up through his hip, the old weather report his body gave on wet nights, and he stood for a second in the cinder block well with one hand on the rail while the building exhaled around him in ductwork hum and distant monitor tones. Antiseptic rode the air in thin waves. Somewhere below, a cartwheel chirped on a bad bearing at regular intervals. A complaint too small for anybody to file, and too constant to ignore once heard. He took the stairs down one flight and then back up the connecting half-level, because this hospital had been added to in pieces, old wing to newer wing, budget year to budget year, and nothing lined up without detours. His boots left dark prints on concrete, speckled with paint drips older than the war he still carried in his bones. In the narrow landing mirror, bolted there so transport staff could see around corners, he caught a tilted reflection of his own face, scar bright against stubble, eyes bloodshot from rain and road spray, leather vest dark at the shoulders, where it had never fully dried. People read that face and decided what the story would be. He had spent 20 years learning that correction rarely came from argument. At 1:36, when he stepped back into the corridor light, he passed a volunteer desk empty, except for a ceramic candy dish with 3 wrapped mints and a sign asking visitors to check in. Nobody looked up from charts when he walked by, but nobody waved him through either. That was the middle ground men like him lived in. Watched without being acknowledged, present but uninvited, useful only when things got heavy enough to lift. He had done his time in places that smelled worse than hospitals and had harder rules. County walls sweating heat in July and cold in December, 2 years measured by meal slots and door buzzers. And he had come out with less patience for men who hurt small people, and less trust in systems that stamped forms and called it care. Basra had taught him the first part. County had taught him the second. He turned left past the pediatric intake station, where cartoon fish peeled from the painted wall in one corner, each curling edge collecting dust. A hand sanitizer dispenser blinked red, empty. A little plastic chair, yellow and scratched, sat upside down on a table because housekeeping had mopped around midnight and never reset the room. The ordinary neglect of overrun places surrounded him, with the same tired accuracy as road maps. Nothing dramatic, just 1,000 small failures that told the truth. In one open doorway, a mother slept in a vinyl recliner with her shoes tucked neatly beneath it, coat over her knees, one hand still resting on a bed rail. In another, a respiratory therapist adjusted tubing and spoke in low, clipped phrases that had no room for comfort and no cruelty in them either. At 1:41, Sandra Briggs came out of medication storage with 2 syringes in a sealed pouch and stopped short when she saw him near the pediatrics threshold. Her glasses were pushed up into her hair now, and a red indent marked the bridge of her nose where they had sat all shift. "You're not lost," she said. "Not quite a question." "No," Paul said. "Stairwell by Shortstay is out." "That one's been out 3 days." She shifted the pouch to her left hand. "You need anything else for your brother?" He squared away. Sandra studied him with the same wary precision she had worn at triage, but fatigue had rubbed some of the edge off it. "State faxed over a transfer sheet on that highway child," she said. "No receiving signature. No guardian listed. Just a line that says moved." Her mouth flattened. "Moved where?" Paul looked down the corridor toward the locked double doors and said nothing. Sandra gave a short nod as if she had answered her own question and walked on, rubber soles whispering over wax tile. She did not apologize for the tone she had used earlier, and he did not ask for one. Respect between strangers like them came by increments, each one earned under fluorescent light. He kept moving, drawn by a feeling he would have mocked in anyone else, a pressure just under the sternum that had nothing to do with injury and everything to do with pattern recognition. In Basra, it had been a corner that looked too clean. In County, it had been a cell block gone quiet all at once. On roads from Ohio to Tennessee, it had been a stopped truck with no hazard triangles and a woman gripping the wheel too still. Instinct was only memory that had learned to move faster than the speech. It had kept him alive in places where hesitation got written on stone. At 1:47, he reached the junction where pediatrics met imaging, and the light changed from warm white to a colder fluorescent tone that made every scuff mark stand out. A maintenance key box hung open beside a fire extinguisher cabinet. From somewhere close, he heard the soft thud of automatic doors cycling and counted it in his head without meaning to. 9 seconds. Open, shut. Open, shut. The hospital keeping rhythm while people inside it drifted in and out of records. He thought of his daughter then. Not because memory arrived cleanly, but because the corridors smelled faintly of grape cough syrup and crayons, and that was enough. Emily had been 6 when he missed the school play because he was on a run to Louisville, and another writer's transmission blew outside Wilmington. 7 when she asked why he and her mother talked like strangers in their own kitchen. 9 when she learned to stop asking for promises. The marriage ended in a courthouse room with buzzing lights and a clerk who did not look up when he signed. 3 states now between him and the last address he had for her. He mailed birthday cards anyway, each one with a return address, printed straight and small, each one coming back or vanishing without reply. Leather and noise had not taken his family from him by themselves. He had done enough of that work with his own hands. The road had simply made no excuses. At 1:52, a transport tech pushing an empty gurney gave him the kind of glance that moved over patches first and face second. "Can I help you?" the man asked. "Just heading out," Paul said. "Use the south stairs. This wing's restricted after 2. Paul nodded and stepped aside. The tech rolled on, wheels rattling over a seam in the floor tile, and smoothing out again. He should have turned back toward the lobby then. He knew that. Visiting hour was over, Brother checked, bike waiting in drizzle under sodium lamps. Instead, he kept down the corridor another 20 yards, past a bulletin board crowded with parenting class flyers and a faded flyer for a foster parent orientation held 3 months earlier. Past a locked playroom with 1 foam block left in the hall and no child to claim it, until he reached the recessed alcove outside supply where light pooled hard and flat over linoleum. At 1:58, he saw the shoes first. Small sneakers, Walmart brand, white once and now dull gray at the rubber toe, set side by side against the baseboard with laces tied into careful double knots, as if someone had tied them to keep the shape, not to wear. They were dry on top and wet along the soles. No adult shoes nearby, no laundry cart, no patient bracelet clipped to a file. Just the shoes and the humming light overhead, and the locked supply closet door with a keypad smudged at child height. He stopped so quickly his heel squeaked. She sat in the angle where the wall met the closet frame, knees pulled in, dress hem still black with road grit, 1 white sock dark to the ankle, and the other foot bare, skin pale from cold and hospital air. Her hair had dried in uneven strands around the broken butterfly clip, 1 wing gone, 1 wing hanging. A thermal blanket had been draped around her shoulders at some point, and then folded back into her lap with precise corners, as if she had done it herself to make less trouble. She did not look up right away. She watched the seam between two floor tiles and moved one fingertip over it like tracing a route. The corridor monitor above her flashed, "Supply access denied," in red text and reset. Paul did not call out for staff. Not yet. He set both hands where she could see them and lowered himself, bad knee stiff, until he was near eye level and far enough away to leave her space. The fluorescent tube buzzed with a faint, intermittent rattle, and in that sound he heard the median wind, the freight wake, the hollow ambulance door closing under bridge concrete. None of it had actually left his body. It had only changed rooms. She lifted her face in small increments, chin first, then eyes. Recognition crossed it. Not relief, not fear, something more practical. Identification of a known object in chaos. She had seen him through rain and strobes. She had stored the fact. Children who had learned to survive did that. Her gaze flicked to his scar, then to his hands, then to the hallway behind him to check exits. At 2:01, a call light chimed twice in a nearby room and went unanswered for 12 seconds. Somewhere down the hall, a printer started and stopped. The door at the far end opened and shut again on its 9-second clock. He kept his voice low. "Hey, kid." She held still. "You remember me from the road?" A pause, then the smallest nod. He glanced once toward the nurse station, still empty at this angle, and back to her. "You waiting on somebody?" Her lips parted, closed, and she shook her head once. Her fingers tightened around the folded blanket edge until the knuckles went white. Paul took one breath through his nose and let it out slowly so she could see the pace of it. In county, he had learned how to sit in silence without filling it. In war, he had learned that urgent moves made scared people bolt. Here, those lessons fit together in a way that felt less like redemption than utility, old damage finding a decent use at last. At 2:03 on that wet Thursday, with fluorescent light flattening every color in the corridor and antiseptic stinging the back of his throat, the girl spoke first, exactly above a whisper. "Please don't send me back outside," she said. The sentence landed in him with clean force, no drama, no confusion. He did not ask who had sent her out. He did not ask why she had no shoes on in a locked hallway. He did not ask for trust. She had no reason to give. He answered the only part that mattered. "You're not going back outside," he said. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. Not enough for anyone across the hall to notice. Enough for him to see. She looked down at the shoes she had lined up like evidence, and then back at him. The broken butterfly pin tapped once against her temple when she moved. Sandra peered at the far corner with a chart in her hand, saw him kneeling there, saw the child, and stopped. The old caution crossed her face again, and then gave way to something harder and more focused. The look of a nurse choosing an argument she was prepared to win. She set the chart on the counter without taking her eyes off the alcove and walked toward them, steps brisk, badge swinging on its clip. Paul stayed where he was, one knee on waxed tile, hands open, while the hospital's automatic doors kept opening and closing somewhere behind the walls. Every 9 seconds, as if routine still had authority over this night. Sandra stopped 3 paces from the alcove and took in the scene the way experienced nurses did, in a sequence built from habit and triage math. Child's airway, color, posture, temperature signs, nearest adult, exits, potential escalations. Her eyes moved from the girl's bare foot to the damp sock, to the folded thermal blanket held too neatly in small hands, then to Paul's open palms and lowered shoulders. She saw no immediate threat and no chart band on the child's wrist. That absence changed her face more than anything else in the corridor. "Sweetheart," she said, and crouched without touching, knees cracking softly under scrubs that had gone stiff with a long shift. "I'm Sandra. I'm one of the nurses here." The girl looked at Sandra's badge, not her eyes, then down to the shoes lined against the baseboard like they were waiting for inspection. She did not answer. Sandra turned her head slightly toward Paul without taking her gaze off the child. "Did she come in with EMS?" "Came in from the interstate," Paul said. "Median at 51. Sandra's jaw tightened. "I know where she came from. I'm asking how she ended up unbanded in a locked corridor." The question sat in fluorescent hum for a beat. Paul had no answer that would help. He shook his head once. At 2:04, Sandra stood and keyed her badge at the nearest workstation. The screen woke to soft blue glare, then populated with overnight intake fields, half-complete lines, and one state transfer packet stamped pending verification. She scrolled with clipped, controlled motions while Paul stayed kneeling in the alcove and the girl kept tracing the seam between two tiles with one finger, back and forth, like a root she trusted more than people. The automatic doors at the distant ER entrance kept cycling on their metronome rhythm, open and shut every 9 seconds, and each soft hydraulic sigh seemed to mock the disorder 2 hallways deeper. Sandra read silently, then out loud, voice flattening into the documentation cadence she used when anger had to become record. "Initial hazard call at 12:21 from civilian driver, silver crossover, mile marker 51, female minor in median. Highway patrol notified 12:22. Engine 14 on scene 12:30. Controlled stop request 12:31. Child extraction 12:49. Arrival through ER 106. Temporary warming, no guardian present." She clicked into attached dispatch notes, and her mouth hardened. State transport entry, 12:27. Child transferred. Receiving signature blank. Guardian field blank. Destination field auto-filled and unverified. Paul watched her shoulders rise and drop with one measured breath. In county, he had learned to spot the moment an official decided whether to bury a mistake or drag it into daylight. Sandra dragged. She pulled the event log from dispatch addenda and read those lines too, this time with the numbers given full weight, each one a small indictment placed carefully on the counter. 112 passenger vehicles passed her before a full stop was established. 19 freight trucks, 1 church van with ministry lettering on rear doors, 1 off-duty deputy in personal pickup, slowed and continued. 2 rideshare units reported obstruction and did not stop. State transport crew entered transfer without receiving signature. Her index finger tapped the desk once on each count. A pastor in that church van. A deputy off-duty but sworn all the same. Neighbors from 3 exits down, according to 2 caller IDs in the transcript. Every single one kept moving. The girl's head came up a fraction when Sandra said, "Pastor," as if the word had texture. She did not speak. Sandra clicked into a second page, then a third, collecting failure lines as if assembling a chain that could not be denied once linked. 2 civilian videos uploaded before EMS handoff. 1 call flagged possible decoy setup, gang concern, advised units to stage. We had fear annotated faster than aid. She looked over her shoulder toward the dark window at the end of the corridor, where rain feathered the glass in thin diagonal lines. And somehow she gets from ER intake to pediatric corridor without a wristband and without assigned receiving guardian? Paul rose slowly from his crouch, bad knee protesting, then leaned one shoulder against the wall so he stayed at the girl's level without looming over her. He had seen this pattern in different uniforms and different buildings, everyone doing their assigned task while the center went unattended. It was never one monster. It was a relay of omissions. At 2:09, Sandra picked up the desk phone and dialed extension 274 twice before anyone answered. "This is Briggs in pediatrics," she said. "I need supervisor presence now, not in 10. Now." A pause. "No, this is not routine. I have a 7-year-old interstate recovery patient, unbanded in a restricted corridor and a transfer line with no receiving signature." Another pause, longer. "Then wake whoever you need to wake." She hung up before the other side could soften it. She returned to the alcove and lowered herself again, slower this time, one hand on the wall for balance. Her voice changed when she addressed the child, less clipped, still precise. "Sweetheart, can you tell me your name?" The girl pressed her lips together. A small tremor moved through the bare foot and stopped. She shifted closer to the closet door without seeming to move at all. "It's okay if you don't want to say it yet," Sandra said. "You are not in trouble. You're safe right here with us." The child looked past Sandra to Paul, checking him the way she had in the median, practical and quick. He gave the smallest nod he could manage, barely more than breath. Sandra followed that glance and understood more than she wanted to. "I need to ask one thing," she said, keeping her tone steady, hands visible. "Did someone tell you to wait here?" No answer. "Did someone bring you here and leave?" No answer again, but the girl's fingers tightened around the folded blanket until the corners bent. Paul saw the moment before it happened. The same way he had seen roadside trouble, one bend before the wreck came into view. Breath held too long, shoulders up, eyes fixed on the nearest exit. He sank back to one knee so his face stayed even with hers and said nothing. Silence, offered correctly, could be a kind of shelter. When the child spoke again, it came from that thin place where sound was almost not sound at all, and both adults leaned in to catch it. "Please don't send me back outside," she whispered, repeating what she had already told Paul. The sentence was short enough to fit in one breath, and heavy enough to alter the corridor. Sandra closed her eyes once, briefly, then opened them and nodded, as if entering an order no one could reverse. "You're not going back outside," she said. "Not tonight. Not again." She did not reach for the child. She held still and let the words land where they could. Paul had already promised the same thing, but hearing the girl say it to Sandra changed the geometry of responsibility. It was no longer his word alone in a hallway. It was now in the record, in an RN's hearing, in institutional air. Some promises survived only if paperwork caught up to them before dawn. By 2:13, the charge supervisor arrived in a cardigan thrown over scrubs and read the top line of Sandra's open chart with a frown meant for inconvenience. Sandra cut that expression off with facts. "Unknown minor recovered from live interstate median. No guardian, no receiving signature, unbanded placement in restricted zone. I need immediate protective hold initiation and social work escalation." Social work isn't in until... "I know what time social work comes in," Sandra said. "Call the on-call list." The supervisor looked from Sandra to Paul to the child and back, calibrating risk against procedure. "We can place temporary observation and reassess at shift change." Sandra's voice stayed level. "Reassess is what put her on a floor by a supply closet." The supervisor exhaled through her nose and reached for the desk phone. Paul listened, arms loose at his sides, while forms began moving at the pace they should have moved an hour earlier. He caught fragments. Emergency protective hold packet. County Child Services notification. Attending physician signature requirement. Security watch note. No release without supervisor countersign. The terms were dry. The stakes were not. He glanced down at the shoes again, those careful double knots, that had stayed tied through rain, ambulance, and institutional drift, and felt something old and immediate lock into place in his chest. At 2:17 on that same wet Thursday, with the first hold form printing in stuttering bursts at the nurse's station, and the child still seated on the linoleum because nobody had yet found a better place that felt safe to her, Paul stepped back into the corridor shadow and pulled his phone from his vest pocket. The screen was spiderwebbed at one corner from a drop in Knoxville 3 summers earlier. He scrolled to one contact and hit call. It rang once. "Reed," came the answer, low and alert despite the hour. Paul kept his voice quiet enough that it would not carry to the alcove. "Code Lantern, North Dayton General, 10 minutes. A short silence on the line. Not confusion, just receipt. "How many?" "Bring the board and the women's chapter first, then Phil." "Understood?" Paul ended the call and put the phone away without explanation, exactly as he had in other crises where language wasted time. He did not look around to see who had heard him. He did not announce what was coming. He returned to the alcove, lowered himself back to one knee, and rested his forearms on his thigh so his hands stayed in sight. Sandra was documenting in tight, slanted handwriting on a paper backup form because the pediatric module had frozen again. She wrote each failure line cleanly. No adjectives, no mercy. Unbanded minor located in restricted corridor 0203. Guardian unknown. Transfer signature absent. Child verbalized fear of return to exterior environment. She underlined exterior environment once. The girl watched Sandra's pen move, then shifted her gaze to Paul's face, and held it there. She still did not cry. That was the part that would stay with all of them long after forms were scanned and archived. From deeper in the hospital, a code bell chimed and stopped. A housekeeper pushed a yellow mop bucket past the junction and glanced at the alcove, then looked away too quickly, ashamed of the reflex as soon as it happened. The supervisor returned with a security officer and a blanket from pediatrics in cartoon print, then paused when the child recoiled from the bright fabric and offered instead a plain gray one from stock. The girl accepted the gray blanket with both hands and folded it into her lap with the same careful corners as before. No one in the corridor yet knew what Paul's call would bring or how quickly asphalt miles could collapse when riders moved with purpose. For one held breath of a minute, there was only fluorescent hum, rain hissing against the far windows, printers spitting out forms that should have existed earlier, and a 7-year-old in one damp sock sitting between a locked closet and 2 adults who had finally decided that routine did not outrank her life. At 2:19, a low vibration touched the base of the supply closet door and ran up the metal frame into the wall where Paul's shoulder rested, too deep to be HVAC and too steady to be passing freight, a mechanical pulse that reached bone first and ear second. Sandra stopped writing mid-sentence, pen tip suspended over the line where she had just underlined exterior environment, and looked toward the corridor window as if the glass might explain itself. The child felt it too. Her small hand flattened on the linoleum, testing the tremor through her palm the way a person checks rain through a porch rail. The sound thickened by layers. One engine became many, many became a braided throb, and the hospital seemed to register it reluctantly, ceiling tiles ticking, IV pole hooks chiming faintly in patient rooms, water in a half-full paper cup near the workstation, shivering with each cycle. North Dayton General had its own night noises, printer bursts, monitor chirps, rubber soles, elevators announcing floors in polite tones, and this new sound moved underneath all of them like a second current under river ice. Paul did not smile. He simply stood, slow because of the knee, and turned enough to put himself between the alcove and the main corridor without blocking Sandra's line to the child. He had made the call, and now the consequence was arriving in proper order. His phone stayed in his pocket, his hand stayed visible. A security officer by the nurse's station touched his radio earpiece and said, "I'm hearing multiple motorcycles entering campus roads, east side first, then south lot." He listened, frowning. "No active aggression. Repeating, no active aggression. They're parking in formation." The charge supervisor moved to the window at the end of the hall and pulled the blind cord halfway down, then stopped and let it rise again. She was seeing the parking lot fill in measured lines and trying to decide whether order looked more frightening than disorder. Outside, rain turned to fine mist and spread the floodlights into halos. Headlights slid across wet concrete in disciplined arcs, then cut out one by one, then in clusters, then in long rows as riders killed engines and dismounted in sequence. Sandra came to stand beside Paul, still holding the chart. "How many did you call?" He kept his eyes on the corridor intersection. "I called one man. That's not what I asked. It's what happened." The rumble did not disappear when engines shut down outside. It persisted as late arrivals rolled off county roads and service drives, as idling lines staged beyond the ambulance bay, as bikes took positions not only at the ER entrance but along each approach lane, where a transport van could have entered, loaded, and exited in under 2 minutes if no one had looked up from paperwork. Sound crossed distance and concrete and entered bodies. Staff felt it in sternums and in teeth. By 2:24, the count came in from 3 sources at once: Campus Security, Highway Patrol Command, and Reed's text to Paul that displayed only a number and a period. 400. 400 riders had answered Code Lantern at North Dayton General. 400. Not a swarm and not a spectacle. A verified moving census. The child looked up at him when his phone lit and dimmed again. "Is it loud because of me?" she whispered. "It's loud because you're not alone," he said. She studied his face for any sign of correction, found none, and lowered her eyes to the folded gray blanket in her lap. In the ER lobby, people who had spent years trusting fluorescent lights and clipboards as proof of safety moved closer to windows and saw leather cuts dark with mist, old denim, reflective traffic vests over club colors, women riders unstrapping helmets with deliberate motions, and men older than their machines standing shoulder to shoulder without shouting. Fear rose first, as it always did when appearance reached the room before explanation. Then explanation arrived by radio and by conduct. No revving in place, no blocked ambulance bay, no one pushing through locked doors. Every rider waiting for assignment from 2 points only: Police Traffic Command, and Reed Bennett, Vice President, standing near the main drive with a legal pad in one hand and a rain-spotted clipboard in the other. Reed came through the ER doors at 2:27 with a temporary visitor sticker stuck crooked on his vest and a nurse escorting him because Sandra had called ahead from the pediatric desk and specified exactly one club officer inside. He was 52, broad through the back, hair gone silver at the temples, voice usually rough from years around engines and cigarettes. Tonight it came out flat and businesslike. "Press," he said quietly to Paul. "Status?" "Outer grid in place. Dayton PD supervising lane control. Highway Patrol took interstate adjacency, so no one says we freelanced it." Reed nodded toward Sandra. Women's chapter staged in waiting area B with 2 pediatric nurses who volunteered. They brought plainclothes kits, socks, shoes, coloring stuff, bottled water, phone chargers for staff if needed. Nobody touches the kid unless you and nurse clear it. Sandra blinked once at the list, then at Reed, recalibrating. "You organized that in 8 minutes. Reed glanced at his watch. 14, from call to full grid. The charge supervisor approached with the security officer close behind. Both braced for argument. None came. Reed handed over the clipboard instead. Names, plate numbers, assigned positions, check-in times. You need this for liability. Keep it, he said. You need one line change. Tell me and I'll change it. The supervisor took the clipboard with both hands as if accepting weight she had not expected to be offered. At 2:31, wall construction began, and it looked less like a protest than a field operation. Outer ring first. 120 riders with reflective armbands and portable flashlights taking lane mouths, service road turns, and loading dock approaches under police direction, creating slow funnels that kept civilian vehicles moving while preventing unsupervised exits by transport units. No one stepped into ambulance routes without hand signals from officers. No one argued with uniforms. On wet pavement under sodium lights, they became movable barricade points measured in boots, cones, and sight lines. Middle ring next, 180 riders at all hospital ingress points, not packed tight, but spaced by doorway width and camera angle, leaving clear channels for patients, staff, and emergency crews while ensuring no child moved through any door unobserved, undocumented, or unaccompanied by named personnel. They stood with hands visible, backs straight, rain beating on leather shoulders. Riders rotated every 12 minutes, so cold did not erode attention. Inner ring last. Vetted women riders, 14 of them, entering in pairs with temporary badges and hospital-issued PPE, joining Sandra and one additional pediatric nurse named Denise Harper, 46, night shift pediatrics for 9 years, known for keeping spare socks in her locker because intake bins never had enough small sizes by dawn. This inner circle did not crowd the child. They established presence and distance, sat when she sat, stood when staff needed passage, and kept the corridor from becoming a stage. Paul stayed at the alcove edge while Denise brought a small foam mat and set it down without comment, letting the girl decide whether to move. The child looked at the mat, at Denise's face, then at Sandra. Sandra nodded once. The girl shifted from cold tile to foam in 2 careful motions, brought her shoes with her, and set them side by side again with the laces still double knotted. No one remarked on the shoes. Everyone saw them. From 2:34 to 2:40, the institution tried its old reflexes. A transfer coordinator called from downstairs asking whether the minor could be moved pending day team review. Sandra asked for her name, title, and callback extension, wrote all 3 on the chart margin, and said, "No movement without active protective hold and attending signature. Document that I said this at 2:36. The coordinator began to answer in policy language. Sandra ended the call first. A state transport representative arrived at pediatrics with a tablet and a neutral expression trained for contested handoffs. He asked who currently had custodial authority. Sandra pointed to the unsigned field on his own imported record. "Not you," she said. "Not me yet. We're fixing that." Reed stood 10 feet away and said nothing. Behind him, 2 women riders in rain-dark boots watched the corridor intersection, and a clock that seemed to crawl. At 2:41, the on-call pediatric attending signed the emergency protective hold after reading Sandra's documentation line by line, asking no rhetorical questions, adding 1 sentence in block capitals. Minor verbalized fear of return to exterior exposure after unsupervised transfer gap. Signature, time, pager number. The form printed twice, once for chart, once for county file. Sandra initialed both copies and slid one into a bright orange folder reserved for legal urgency. The wall held while paperwork caught up to conscience. Outside, the rumble had settled into a perimeter hum, as late arrivals took overflow lots and shut down cleanly. Campus cameras recorded rows of parked motorcycles like dark commas across wet concrete. Civilians entering the ER stepped through channels held open by men and women they had been taught to cross the street to avoid. Staff who had started the hour with locked-jaw suspicion began asking practical questions: where to direct overnight dialysis families, which door remained best for respiratory intake, how to keep media vans from blocking the turn lane. Riders answered in short sentences and pointed with open hands. At 2:47, a county child services worker finally called back, voice thick with sleep and procedural caution. Sandra put the call on speaker beside the workstation, so there would be no ambiguity later. Unknown female, approximately 7, she said. Interstate median recovery. Documented transfer defects. Protective hold active. You are requested on site. A pause. No, mourning is not acceptable. You will find 400 witnesses to chain of custody if needed. The line went quiet, then returned with a revised ETA. The child had spoken only twice since the call went out. Once to ask for water. Once to ask if she could keep both blankets, gray and thermal. Denise brought a cup with a straw and said yes. The girl drank in 3 small pulls, then tucked the thermal blanket under the gray one, as if layering weather protection around a fragile object. Paul watched from 2 paces back, giving her the same space he would give a skittish horse on a dark road. Close enough to help, far enough not to corner. At 2:52, Sandra sat on the floor opposite the child, chart closed for the first time in an hour, and rubbed the dent bridge on her nose where her glasses had sat all shift. She looked toward the corridor window where reflected blue and amber lights pulsed over tile, then back to Paul. I spent 11 years thinking noise meant danger in this building, she said. Tonight, noise bought her time. Paul glanced toward the distant entrance where boots moved and radios crackled and engines idled like far thunder held at bay. Tonight, noise kept the door honest. The girl listened, not fully understanding the sentence, understanding the tone. She set her cup down, reached for her sneakers, and held them against her chest for a moment before placing them back in their neat pair on the foam mat. Outside her alcove, the wall stayed in place, logistical and unblinking, while the systems that had let her drift began, finally, to do their job under witness. At 3:03, the county worker came through pediatric doors, carrying a canvas file bag darkened by rain at the seams, her badge clipped to a cardigan sleeve because she had dressed in a hurry and missed the lapel, her name reading Dana Mercer in black block letters rubbed pale at the edges. She was 41, 6 years in Montgomery County Child Services, known in 2 hospitals for finishing a case before sunrise when most people were already surrendering to shift change delay. She took one look at the alcove, at the gray blanket folded over the thermal one, at the shoes lined heel-to-wall with their double knots still tied, and her posture changed from defensive procedure to immediate custody work. Sandra met her halfway with the orange folder held flat in both hands. Provisional hold at 2:41, attending signature and chart, county callback logged at 2:47, she said. I need full protective placement before day discharge starts moving bodies and beds. Dana opened the folder and read while standing, rainwater dripping from her cuffs onto linoleum. Transfer field unverified, receiving signature blank. She read softly, then flipped to Sandra's handwritten addendum, where each failure was time-stamped. Who document this line? She asked, finger on. Child verbalized fear of return to exterior environment. I did, Sandra said. Dana nodded once. Good record. She crouched to the child's level, keeping 2 arm lengths between them. I'm Dana. I help kids pick where they go next when adults have made a mess. Her voice was plain, no coaxing. Can you tell me your first name? Or do you want me to wait? The girl looked down at the butterfly clip shadow on her blanket, then up toward Paul as if checking the terms of an agreement he had already honored. "Lily," she whispered. Dana wrote it immediately on the top page, then asked, "Do you know a Rachel Boone in Montgomery County?" Lily's fingers tightened around the blanket edge and then eased. A nod. At 3:11, Dana called the on-call county line from the corridor desk, put it on speaker, and read every field aloud so no one could pretend later that they had heard something else. Full name from child self-identification. Estimated age 7. Interstate recovery. No legal guardian present. Emergency protective hold requested for immediate kinship placement with prelicensed relative Rachel Boone. License ID and home study renewal date confirmed in state portal. The supervisor on speaker asked for photographic confirmation of injuries. Dana answered, "No acute injury observed. Exposure risk documented. Psychological risk high due to repeated external abandonment statements," and requested teleauthorization without delay. He gave it at 3:19, voice flattened by fatigue and policy. Outside, the wall held exactly as long as needed, and not 1 minute longer. By the time Dana reached her third call, Dayton police had reopened 2 interstate lanes under controlled speed while keeping the hospital approaches locked to supervised flow. 400 riders had arrived. At 3:22, 180 were released in phased groups. Names checked off Reed's clipboard before engines turned. The remaining formation stayed on doors and drives. Fewer bodies now, same discipline. No one argued when a lieutenant redirected 6 bikes to clear respiratory intake access. They moved, reset, and held. The state transport representative returned at 3:27 with a second tablet and a paper correction form, this time with his regional manager on video call in the corner square. He looked younger under fluorescent lights, less neutral, more aware of how close his entry had come to becoming disappearance. "I'm submitting an amended incident record," he said to Dana and Sandra. Original, child transferred status was entered in error without receiving signature. I am attaching corrective statement and crew IDs. "Read it out loud," Dana said. He did. Sandra checked each line against her notes, then signed as witness. Dana countersigned for county intake and had security scan both pages into the legal archive before anyone could misfile them under routine transport logs. The 2 civilian videos from the overpass were uploaded into the same file at 3:34, tagged with chain of custody metadata and caller numbers. A trooper brought a supplemental report 5 minutes later listing the church van plate and the off-duty deputy vehicle ID, both referred for agency review. The housekeeper, who had looked away in the corridor, passed once with a fresh mop head and never offered explanation. The floor dried anyway. At 3:41, the final protective hold authorization, printed on green legal stock from administration, slower than it should have, the printer pausing twice with a grinding stutter before finishing line 6. Sandra set the page on the counter, pressed her palm flat over the corner while the ink cooled, and read the closing sentence to the room. Minor to remain under hospital protective custody until direct handoff to approved kinship caregiver. The charge supervisor, the same woman who had first asked for reassessment at shift change, signed beneath it and said quietly, without looking up, "I should have moved faster." No one relieved her of that sentence. No one added to it. By 4:02, Denise had replaced the blinking, empty sanitizer cartridge outside pediatrics and brought Lily a clean pair of hospital socks with yellow grip strips. Lily accepted 1 sock and kept 1 foot bare. She asked to keep her own sneakers with the tied laces and the broken butterfly clip in her hair. Dana approved both as personal effects and document them item by item. 1 pair child sneakers, white/gray, laces tied, one plastic butterfly hair clip, pink, one wing broken, one gray blanket issued pediatrics, one thermal blanket issued field. Sandra printed a temporary wristband that read Lily B, protective hold, and let Lily watch before fastening it, so the band arrived as information, not restraint. At 4:18, Reed came back inside for final coordination, rain dried to salt at the shoulders of his vest. "Outer ring can step down on your word," he said to Dana. "After caregiver signs in and exits campus," Dana replied. He nodded and handed her his legal pad copy. "Every rider assignment and release time. Keep it for the file." She took it, surprised despite herself. "Most groups don't hand me cleaner logs than my own office." Reed's expression did not change. Most groups didn't get this call. The hospital kept its ordinary defects through the rest of the dark hours. The water stain, shaped like Florida, still spread over the same ceiling tile near the turn to imaging. The work order on the corkboard stayed yellow and pending. The automatic doors at the ER entrance still opened and closed every 9 seconds, counting off a night that had refused to be routine. What changed was narrower and harder to fake. Every transfer packet in pediatrics got a second signature before dawn, and no one left a child unaccompanied between stations again. At 5:12 on Friday morning, Rachel Boone arrived from Montgomery County in a Navy sedan with a cracked rear taillight taped at the edge and a state foster license clipped inside a clear badge holder around her neck. She was 38, Lily's mother's cousin by blood, and Aunt Rachel by usage since Lily was 3, license for kinship placement for 19 months, renewal completed in August. She stepped into the corridor smelling of cold rain and peppermint gum, saw Lily on the foam mat, and stopped with both hands against her own chest, as if making sure she had reached the right body in the right room. Lily looked at her for 3 full seconds without moving. Then she stood, leaving the blankets folded behind her in 2 careful squares, and took 3 small steps forward. Rachel dropped to one knee. "Hey, Bug," she said, voice breaking only on the second word. Lily touched Rachel's sleeve first, then leaned in. It was not dramatic. It was specific and complete. Dana handled the handoff in strict sequence. She verified ID against license, read placement terms aloud, document belongings, and had Rachel sign 3 copies: county custody receipt, hospital discharge under protective hold, emergency contact update. Sandra attached the corrected transport addendum and the 2 video references to the file, then sealed the packet in a tamper strip envelope marked Montgomery CPS, October the 27th, 5:29. The state transport representative's correction stayed in front, not buried. The off-duty deputy and church van referral numbers were written on the final page. Every open thread received ink. When it was time to walk to discharge, Lily paused by the vinyl chair, where Paul had been sitting through the last hour with his forearms on his thighs, and his scar turned pale in the dawn light coming through wired glass. He lifted his hand, rough knuckles and old grease marks still visible despite repeated washing, and held it open without reaching. Lily placed her hand inside his for exactly 1 hallway length, from the supply alcove to the doorway where the floor changed from pediatric tile to main corridor wax, then let go and took Rachel's hand instead. That was the whole gesture. It was enough. At 5:37, Dana and Sandra escorted Rachel and Lily through the ER entrance while police held the curb lane for 60 seconds. Outside, the remaining riders stood in 2 quiet lines that left a clean path to the sedan. Helmets stayed off. Hands stayed at their sides. As Rachel buckled Lily into the rear seat, Lily looked through the rain-dotted window toward Paul, then down at her own shoes resting on the seat beside her, still tied in those careful double knots. She set them neatly heel to heel before the door shut. Reed gave the signal at 5:41. Engines turned in staggered sequence, low and controlled, then peeled out by assigned exits under traffic command until the lot was ordinary again, except for water arcs where tires had stood and cooled. By 5:52, the last bike cleared campus. Dispatch updated the incident classification from possible gang convergence to coordinated civilian assistance under law enforcement supervision. The amended label sat in the system, where the first fear entry had sat hours earlier. Sandra watched Rachel's sedan merge onto the county route from the ambulance bay window, one hand on the sill, glasses back on her nose, chart finally closed. "She'll have a room today," she said, mostly to herself. Paul stood beside her, knees clicking when he shifted weight, and looked out at the wet morning, finding its regular traffic. "She had one before that," he said. "Just took all night to make it real." Reputation had pointed at danger and been wrong, while character did the work in plain sight and left a paper trail no one could erase. Sometimes the road did not create who a person was at all. It only stripped away enough comfort for the truth to show.